Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. In past episodes, we've looked at reports of cryptids with near supernatural abilities, as well as claims of ghostly and unexplained poltergeist activity. In this episode, however, we'll be looking at a mysterious series of events that involve both ghosts and poltergeists. Come with us as we explore the horrifying history of the Hexham Heads. The schoolgirl pushed open the low wooden gate that led to her front garden and waved goodbye to her two friends as they walked down Rose Road. She knew that her parents would still be at work for another hour or two, so she didn't want to bother them. She bent down to get the front door key from where it was hidden under the flower pot. Then, as she did every night, she let herself in. Denise Ross put her school blazer and bag on the peg that was hers when she got home from school. She then looked around for the family cat. The ginger Tom was less than a year old, very curious, and waited for her every time she came back in the hallway. Still, the room was dark and quiet today, and there was no sign of the family pet calling out its name. Denise stopped for a second, and then she heard a happy, muffled cry coming from the front room. The girl walked down the hall and opened the door to find a small cat sitting there and staring back at her. She reached out to grab the cat. She was shocked when it suddenly attacked her with angry claws. She looked down at her pet in disbelief because it had never done anything like this before. She moved out into the hall slowly. Denise was almost out the door when she heard a thud from the landing, where she should have been alone. The 15-year-old girl called out for her parents, but all she heard back was silence. She looked up into the dark shadows that covered the top of the stairs. Denise thought she was going crazy and turned her attention back to the cat when she heard another soft thud from above her. Almost right away, the small animal made a sound like a scared mule and moved farther into the living room. Bernice started to move toward the front door, but she kept looking up the stairs. Slowly, a foot stepped out of the shadow and carefully planted itself on the highest step. It stayed there for a moment, then another one came down the next step. They were like nothing she had ever seen before. They were covered in a thick coat of fur, and their long toes had sharp claws on them. Step by step, they started to make their way down the stairs toward her. A scary ghost-like figure appeared, and its whole body was covered in the same dark hair. She could now see that its face was dominated by a long snout, and its wide mouth was full of sharp teeth. As the intruder looked at her with a searching gaze, its mouth opened even wider, and its thick tongue hung out to one side. The girl screamed as loudly and as long as she could, and the terrifying creature ran away, jumping up and over the banister above it and out of sight. When Richard Feacham got home from work a few hours later, he found his daughter locked in the living room. She had locked the door and was holding her beloved cat in her arms because she was still too scared to go anywhere else in their home. The incident was the last straw for Richard. He called the university where his wife worked and told them in no uncertain terms that she had to leave. Either she took the ancient artifact she was studying out of their home, or he took the kids and left. The strange story of the two mysterious objects that became known as the Hexham Heads began in May 1971 in the back garden of 3 Reed Avenue, an anonymous house in Hexham, Northumberland. This was the home of the Robson family, and on the day in question, their two sons, Colin and Leslie, were playing in the back garden. They were playing a game in which they dug small rocks out of the ground and threw them at each other. They had been doing this for a while, which made their mother angry. When she went outside to check on them, both boys stopped what they were doing and gave their mother a pair of strangely smooth stones that looked like they had crude human faces carved on them. They were about 6 centimeters in diameter, but their shapes looked very different. One looked like a young boy and had more masculine features, while the other looked more like a girl. They were very happy with what they had found. The two boys brought the stones back into the house and put them to the side, but they would come to regret this choice in the days to come. Along with the two artifacts, the adults of the family noticed that the stones seemed to be able to move on their own. When Mr. and Mrs. Robson woke up in the morning, they would find that their heads had been turned around overnight and were now facing the opposite direction from how they had been left the night before. Sometimes they were found on the floor, and sometimes they were in a different room than where they had been left. Not long after this, glass objects broke inside the house for no apparent reason, even though no one was near them at the time. All of the broken glass was collected and thrown away, but long shards were later found hidden under the pillows of the girls in the house. Both boys were very sure they had nothing to do with the wrongdoing, but they were caught. Then, after a few weeks of strange things happening, Colin woke up in the middle of the night crying. When Mrs. Robson went to comfort him, he told her that he'd felt a pair of invisible hands pull his hair while he was sleeping. Colin's mother was sitting on his bed, trying to calm him and his brother, who had been woken up by the noise. All of a sudden, she noticed that someone was looking up at her from the doorway. She was horrified to see a ghostly figure looking back at her from the entrance to the room. It looked like a person, but it was completely covered in fur and had a face like a goat or sheep. As soon as this thing found out Mrs. Robson could see it, it went away right away, leaving no sign that it had ever been there. They tried to explain it away by saying they were upset and tired. The scared housewife chose not to tell anyone else about what happened, but she was horrified. Soon after, her neighbors told her that they had seen the same thing. Number 1 Reed Avenue was right next door to the Robson family's house. It was owned by Isaac and Nellie Dodd, who were having a drink with their 4 children. One night, while talking to her neighbor, Nellie asked if the Robsons had seen or heard anything strange in the weeks before. When asked why, she told them about a scary thing that had happened a few nights before. Young Marie Dodd had a bad ear infection, so Nellie went into her room at bedtime to comfort her. Just as Marie was about to fall asleep, her daughter suddenly sat up in bed and started screaming so loudly that Marie couldn't stop her. Nellie had begged her to tell her what was wrong, and she was horrified when she slowly raised a finger and pointed to something behind her. When the mother turned around, she saw a scary creature standing at her shoulder and reaching for her with a long, thin hand. The person who broke in had the body of a man but the face of several different animals, like a mix of a wolf and a goat. Nellie started to scream almost as soon as her daughters did, and their frantic cries blended with hers. The 2 women watched in horror as the creature got down on all fours and ran out of the room as Isaac Dodd ran across the landing towards the bedroom. He stopped in his tracks when he heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs behind him. As he ran back up the stairs, he heard the back door to the address open. As he ran down the stairs and into the hallway, the door was now wide open. Isaac had locked the door himself an hour ago, so he didn't know how it had been opened. What was even stranger was that there was no sign of anyone in the garden, even though it was surrounded by high fences and the side gate still had a deadbolt on it. In the days after the meeting, things started to happen at number 1 that were similar to what happened at the Robson house. Even though no one was there at the time, several bottles were seen to fall off tables and break on the floor. The children also said over and over that an invisible hand had hit them or pulled their hair. When things got bad enough, the Dodds thought about leaving the area. However, as time went on, it became clear that whatever had been bothering them wasn't connected to the town of Hexham. After what seemed to be poltergeist attacks for a few weeks, the Robson family finally had enough and gave the heads to the Abbey staff. From there, the items were sent to Southampton University to be studied. They ended up on the desk of a lecturer named Anne Ross. Dr. Ross was an expert in pagan history, and he thought that the 2 small stone carvings were probably from the Celtic area. Eventually, as part of her analysis, she took them home and put them in a box, but then she forgot about them. A week later, Dr. Ross woke up in the middle of the night because she felt someone in her bedroom. As her husband slept next to her, she strained her eyes and looked into the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, she saw a dark shape standing in the shadows. As the figure ran toward the door, she caught a brief glimpse of a tall, thin body. It moved upright as a 2-legged bipod covered in jet black fur and with a wolf-like snout sticking out of its face. It jumped out of bed to chase after it. The doctor saw it go down her stairs, but he was too scared to go after it. At first, She didn't think the event had anything to do with the Hexham Heads, but a few days later, they met again. Richard, her husband, was sick and in bed. Their 15-year-old daughter was bringing him a meal upstairs when she was stopped by a scary thing that was trying to scream. The intruder jumped over the banister and was no longer seen. The little girl could hear the animal's feet hitting the wooden floor of the hall below, but when she went to look, she saw nothing. When nothing happened that was like it over the next week, the professor thought the matter was over, but then her husband called her angry on the phone. He came home while she was at work to find that Denise had locked herself in the living room and was too scared to come out. When she had calmed down, she told him she had seen the creature on her way home from school. She now knows what happened to the things she was keeping. The doctor quickly took them away and had the university put them in storage. The heads would stay there for 7 years, going through tests every now and then, until a man named Frank Hyde bought them. He was an engineer who was interested in ghosts and asked if he could use a Faraday cage to test them. When Hyde died in 1980, he took the information about where the heads were with him. His tests on the items have never been made public, but some of the tests done at the university have been. The studies done by the people at Southampton University have only made it harder to figure out where the Hexham Heads came from. They were carved so roughly that it was hard to find techniques from any other time period that matched them. Also, the stones didn't have any living things in them, which makes it almost impossible to date them. It was found that they were made of what looked like solid rock, not a modern composite or cement, and that the rock used was gray sandstone with a lot of quartz. This was in line with the shapes of the rocks in the area right around Hexham. There was no evidence that the Counts had ever lived in the area, and the stones were not like anything found in the culture of the Roman settlers who founded the town in 1970. A local tradesman named Des Craigie came forward to say that he had carved the stones for his daughter when he lived at 3 Reed Avenue before the Robsons moved in. To prove his point, he made a number of copies made from a composite material made from local crushed stone. But even though they were similar in some ways, academics didn't believe Craigie because the carvings and materials used were different. So, if the Hexham Heads weren't some kind of joke or strange thing made by a local person, what were they? Since there isn't much else to go on, it seems like Dr. Ross's comparisons may be the best explanation. The Counts thought that the head was where the soul of a person was, and they thought that carvings of heads on stones could connect people to the spirit world. Many crude carvings of stone heads have been found all over Britain. They are often found near water, which was thought to be a way for the dead to travel. Hexham is also no stranger to stories about wolf-like creatures. In 1904, the town and the nearby village of Allendale were both hit by a series of brutal cattle killings. Veterinarians who looked at the bodies said that the culprit was probably a large wolf, and over the next few months, several of these predators were hunted down and killed. But the killings went on for another year before they suddenly stopped. There seems to be no reason. Dr. Ross said she had never heard the story of the Wolf of Allendale when she was later asked about the Hexham Heads. Since the mid-1970s, a lot of time has passed, and Southampton and Northumbria are a long way apart, and the story is mostly about a small area. This seems very likely. The families involved in the story have not changed how they talk about what happened. The press was not very interested at the time, and that interest has long since gone away. Perhaps the only way to bring the story back to life would be to admit that it was a fake. But even though they lost the stones, both the Ross and Dodd children still stand by their claims. We probably won't ever know what link there was between how they were made and the strange humanoid things that seem to be attached to them. All we can do is wait and see if more similar artifacts turn up in the future, and if they do, what else comes up with them. Ana Peña is the 10th highest mountain in the world, but it is the most dangerous to climb. Try going up there in your checkered salad chef slippers. Bedtime story.